The pillbox kept firing, and the orders said advance again. Men fell in the same field we had crossed the day before. My superiors wanted coordination and artillery we did not have. I could see the rear slope they could not. When I moved along the irrigation channel, I knew the plan did not include me. On 14th October 1944, Allied forces were engaged in sustained operations along the German border near the town of Aachen. The 1st U.S. Army had advanced from Normandy across northern France and Belgium during the late summer, but by early autumn the rapid movement had slowed. German defenses stiffened as the front approached the West Wall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line. Concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified villages created a defensive belt that favored the defender. Rain and deteriorating roads further restricted mobility. Supply columns stretched over long distances, and artillery ammunition had to be rationed carefully. The 1st Infantry Division, attached to 7 Corps, had been assigned a sector east of the Wurm River. Its battalions were tasked with reducing fortified positions that guarded approaches to Aachen. The fighting differed markedly from the open pursuit of August. Now, progress was measured in yards rather than miles. Infantry companies advanced behind preparatory barrages, only to find machine gun nests and concealed mortar positions intact. German defenders withdrew methodically from one prepared position to another, conserving manpower while inflicting steady casualties. Private First Class Daniel Mercer, age 24, served as a rifleman in Company B of the 26th Infantry Regiment. He had arrived in France in late July as a replacement following losses sustained during the breakout from St. Lo. Mercer had completed basic training at Camp Roberts in California and further instruction in small unit tactics in England before crossing the Channel. By October, he had experienced intermittent combat, but had not yet participated in a sustained assault against fixed fortifications. On the morning of 14th October, Company B occupied shallow positions along a hedgerow overlooking a narrow valley. The fields beyond were divided by drainage ditches and low stone walls. To the east, partially obscured by mist, stood a cluster of farm buildings reinforced by German engineers. A concrete pillbox had been identified on the northern edge of the farmstead, oriented westward to cover the approach road. Intelligence from reconnaissance patrols indicated interlocking fields of fire from at least 2 machine guns. Mercer's assigned role that day was routine. He carried an M1 Garand rifle and additional bandoliers of ammunition for his squad's automatic rifleman. The squad leader, Staff Sergeant Howard Leland, had instructed the men to remain low and avoid unnecessary movement until artillery preparation began. Mercer used the interval to inspect his rifle and check the alignment of his sights. He noted the dampness in the air and the difficulty of keeping equipment dry. Mud adhered to boots and webbing, increasing fatigue. Shortly before noon, American artillery commenced a controlled barrage against the farm complex. Observers believed the concentration sufficient to neutralize surface defenses. The bombardment lasted approximately 15 minutes. Smoke and dust obscured the structures. Company B then advanced in extended line, using shallow depressions for cover. Mercer moved at a steady pace behind Leland, keeping interval with the man to his left. Initial resistance appeared limited. No immediate fire met the first elements as they crossed the initial field. However, when the leading platoon reached a drainage ditch approximately 200 yards from the farm, automatic fire erupted from the pillbox. The rounds struck the embankment and cut through exposed grass. One soldier in the lead squad was hit in the shoulder and pulled back by a medic. The artillery preparation had failed to silence at least one of the primary defensive positions. Company B halted and attempted to deploy smoke grenades to mask further movement. The wind, light but inconsistent, dispersed the smoke unevenly. German machine gun fire adjusted quickly, targeting gaps in the screen. Mortar rounds began landing behind the advancing elements, suggesting that forward observers within the farm complex remained operational. Mercer lay prone behind the ditch, pressed against wet earth. He observed that the pillbox aperture was narrow and partially shielded by rubble from earlier shelling. Rifle fire directed toward the opening produced no visible effect. The squad's Browning automatic rifle delivered bursts toward the embrasure, but the angle was shallow. Leland signaled for a shift to the right flank, where a shallow depression might offer a covered approach. Movement across open ground proved costly. 2 additional men were wounded during the attempt to reposition. The company commander requested renewed artillery support via field radio. However, communications were intermittent. German counter-battery fire had begun targeting suspected American gun positions, and higher headquarters hesitated to allocate additional shells without clearer assessment of enemy strength. By mid-afternoon, Company B had expended significant ammunition without appreciable gain. The pillbox continued to command the central approach. A second fortified position, previously unconfirmed, began firing from a stone outbuilding on the southern edge of the farm. The interlocking pattern restricted maneuver options. Tanks from an attached armored unit had been scheduled to support the assault, but the muddy terrain and a damaged bridge to the rear delayed their arrival. Mercer's squad was ordered to hold in place while engineers assessed the possibility of employing demolition charges. The engineers, advancing cautiously, found that the ground between the ditch and the pillbox was partially mined. Probing operations required time and exposed personnel to observation. One engineer was injured when a mine detonated prematurely. Throughout the afternoon, rain intensified. Visibility declined, complicating observation for both sides. Mercer assisted in redistributing ammunition and water among his squad. He noted the fatigue evident in Leland's movements and the reduced volume of fire from neighboring platoons. Casualty evacuation over muddy ground proved slow, and stretcher bearers struggled to maintain footing. Reports from battalion headquarters indicated similar difficulties across the sector. Other companies attempting to breach the west wall encountered reinforced concrete positions resistant to standard artillery calibers. The defensive network had been constructed over several years, and its resilience exceeded many earlier assessments. Commanders faced the challenge of maintaining momentum while conserving manpower for anticipated operations deeper into Germany. As daylight faded, Company B received orders to disengage under cover of darkness and establish defensive positions along the original hedgerow. The farm complex remained in German hands. Mercer withdrew with his squad in controlled bounds, pausing to cover adjacent elements. Sporadic fire followed their movement but did not intensify. By evening, the men had returned to shallow foxholes scraped earlier that week. Rations were distributed sparingly. Medical personnel continued treating the wounded under dim light. The day's effort had yielded no territorial gain and had cost several casualties. The pillbox at the northern edge of the farm remained active, its presence a reminder of the limitations encountered. Mercer sat with his back against damp earth, cleaning mud from the action of his rifle. He listened to distant artillery exchanges and the low murmur of officers conferring behind the line. The operational objective for the following day remained unchanged: reduce the fortified farm and open the road toward Aachen. Yet the method by which this would be accomplished was unclear. The terrain, weather, and prepared defenses had combined to stall progress. Night settled over the valley with intermittent shell bursts illuminating the horizon. Company B prepared for renewed operations at first light, aware that the same defensive positions would confront them again. During the night of 14th to 15th October 1944, intermittent artillery exchanges continued across the sector east of the Wurm River. Rain persisted, turning shallow foxholes into pools of standing water. At battalion headquarters, officers reviewed reconnaissance sketches and casualty reports under dimmed lantern light. The conclusion was consistent with similar engagements along the west wall. The German fortifications were intact, and frontal assault without coordinated support would continue to produce losses without measurable progress. At first light on 15th October, Company B resumed observation of the farm complex. Morning mist lingered in the valley, partially concealing the pillbox that had halted the previous day's advance. Through field glasses, platoon leaders confirmed that the embrasure remained operational. Occasional muzzle flashes indicated that the position was manned and supplied. The revised plan called for a coordinated effort. Tanks from the 745th Tank Battalion were to advance along the approach road once engineers cleared a path through suspected minefields. Infantry would follow closely, using the armored vehicles as mobile cover. Artillery was assigned a shorter, more concentrated barrage focused on the northern edge of the farm. Mercer's squad received instructions to move on the right flank, maintaining contact with the adjacent platoon. The routine of preparation was familiar: weapons inspected, grenades redistributed, and final instructions given in restrained tones. Staff Sergeant Leland reminded the men to keep intervals tight once the tanks moved forward. "Stay with the armor," he said quietly. "Don't outpace it." The artillery preparation began at 08:30 hours. This time the fire was more concentrated but shorter in duration. As shells impacted around the pillbox and adjacent structures, tanks emerged from behind a hedgerow to the rear. Their engines labored in the mud, tracks grinding against saturated soil. Engineers walked ahead cautiously, probing for mines and marking cleared lanes with white tape. Initially, progress appeared steady. The lead tank advanced approximately 100 yards before encountering resistance. A concealed anti-tank gun, positioned beyond the farm's southern boundary, opened fire. The first round struck the lead vehicle's frontal armor without penetration but forced it to halt. A second shot disabled its right track, immobilizing it in the open field. The crew remained inside as infantry sought cover behind the stalled vehicle. Simultaneously, machine gun fire resumed from the pillbox. The concentrated artillery had not destroyed the structure. At most, it had disrupted operations temporarily. German defenders demonstrated coordinated timing, allowing the American armor to expose itself before engaging. Mercer advanced behind the disabled tank, keeping low against its hull. He observed that the interlocking fields of fire were more extensive than previously assessed. The stone outbuilding to the south had been reinforced with sandbags, creating a secondary strong point. From this position, rifle and machine gun fire swept the right flank, limiting maneuver options. Company B attempted to deploy smoke once more. The damp conditions caused several grenades to sputter before fully igniting. Where smoke did billow, shifting wind patterns created uneven concealment. Communication between infantry and armor grew strained amid engine noise and incoming rounds. A radio operator near Mercer was struck by shrapnel from a mortar explosion, further complicating coordination. By mid-morning, the attack stalled again. Engineers attempting to approach the pillbox with demolition charges were forced to withdraw under sustained fire. One tank maneuvered to bring its main gun to bear on the embrasure, firing high-explosive rounds at close range. Though the impact scarred the concrete and dislodged debris, the aperture remained functional. German fire resumed shortly after each shot. Casualties mounted gradually rather than dramatically. A squad leader from the adjacent platoon was killed while attempting to reposition his men along a drainage ditch. 2 more soldiers were evacuated with leg wounds. The medics worked methodically, applying field dressings and administering morphine where necessary. Stretcher teams navigated the muddy ground with visible difficulty. Mercer continued operating within the narrow space afforded by the disabled tank and a shallow depression in the field. He distributed ammunition to the automatic riflemen and relayed hand signals from Leland to neighboring elements. He noticed that repeated attempts to suppress the pillbox achieved only temporary reduction in fire. Each pause lasted minutes at most before machine gun bursts resumed. By early afternoon, Battalion Command authorized a limited withdrawal to prevent further attrition without gain. The immobilized tank was destroyed by its crew to prevent capture, smoke rising steadily from its hull. Infantry units disengaged in controlled bounds, dragging equipment and assisting wounded comrades where possible. German fire followed, but did not pursue aggressively beyond established fields of defense. Back at the hedgerow, officers convened to reassess the situation. Reports from other companies confirmed similar obstacles. The west wall fortifications in this sector were deeper and more integrated than anticipated. Artillery alone proved insufficient against reinforced concrete. Armor could not maneuver freely without secure flanks and cleared approaches. Engineers required sustained suppression to operate effectively, yet suppression could not be maintained under interlocking fire. Within Company B, fatigue became increasingly evident. Men had slept intermittently over the past 48 hours. Rations were damp, and equipment required constant cleaning to prevent malfunction. Mercer observed Leland reviewing a hand-drawn sketch of the farm layout, marking suspected firing positions. The sergeant's expression suggested recognition of a persistent tactical dilemma. Late in the afternoon, a reconnaissance patrol was dispatched under cover of sporadic artillery fire to probe the southern boundary of the farm. The patrol returned with limited new information. The anti-tank gun was positioned in a shallow defilade beyond a low stone wall, making direct approach hazardous. The pillbox's rear entrance could not be clearly identified from existing vantage points. Official doctrine emphasized coordinated combined arms assault. Yet in practice, terrain and weather constrained execution. Requests for additional artillery were met with reminders of ammunition conservation. Higher command prioritized multiple objectives along the front, distributing resources accordingly. Company-level commanders faced the immediate problem with limited means. As evening approached on 15th October, Company B had suffered further losses without breaching the farm's defenses. The objective remained tactically significant. Control of the road would facilitate movement toward Aachen's outer districts. However, repeated frontal attempts had demonstrated the strength of the position. Mercer sat in a shallow trench with members of his squad, cleaning accumulated mud from his rifle's operating rod. Conversation was subdued. The day's events had followed a pattern familiar to many units confronting prepared defenses: advance, encounter concealed resistance, attempt suppression, withdraw under mounting casualties. No single failure could be isolated. Rather, a series of limitations combined to halt progress. Behind the line, battalion staff officers continued to consider options. Air support was discussed but deemed uncertain due to weather. Night infiltration was contemplated, though minefields and unknown obstacles posed risks. The problem of the pillbox and its supporting positions remained unresolved. Darkness settled gradually over the valley. German flares illuminated portions of the field intermittently, casting brief, stark light over churned earth and disabled equipment. Company B prepared for another night in wet foxholes, aware that the fortified farm still controlled the approach. The operational objective persisted, but the means to achieve it remained constrained by terrain, weather, and the resilience of the defense. By the morning of 16th of October 1944, the engagement east of the Wurm River had entered its third day without measurable territorial gain. Battalion headquarters adjusted its timetable, but the operational objective remained unchanged. The fortified farm complex had to be reduced in order to secure the approach road toward Aachen. Reports from adjacent sectors indicated incremental progress elsewhere, increasing pressure on units that had yet to advance. Weather conditions improved slightly at dawn. The rain diminished to a light drizzle, and visibility across the valley increased. From the hedgerow, Company B could clearly observe the scarred facade of the northern pillbox. Tank fire from the previous day had chipped concrete around the embrasure but had not compromised its structural integrity. The southern stone outbuilding remained intact, its sandbagged windows dark and still. Battalion Command ordered a temporary pause in large-scale assault operations to reassess methods. Artillery would maintain intermittent harassing fire to limit enemy movement, but no full barrage was scheduled that morning. Engineers were tasked with surveying alternative approaches under limited infantry cover. Within this pause, routine tasks continued. Mercer assisted in carrying ammunition forward to a forward supply point established behind the hedgerow. He noted that several replacement soldiers had arrived overnight, assigned to fill gaps left by casualties. Their uniforms were cleaner, their movements tentative. Staff Sergeant Leland integrated them into existing squads with brief instruction, emphasizing fields of fire and recognition signals. Late in the morning, a reconnaissance element from Company B crawled forward along a shallow irrigation channel that angled toward the farm's northern boundary. Their objective was to determine whether the pillbox's rear could be approached from a defilated position not visible from the main embrasure. The patrol returned with partial information. The terrain behind the pillbox sloped downward toward a small orchard bordered by wire. However, scattered mines had been observed near the perimeter. Mercer listened as Leland discussed the report with the platoon leader, Lieutenant Charles Whitaker. The lieutenant studied the sketch provided by the patrol. The official plan called for renewed combined arms assault once sufficient artillery support could be allocated. Yet availability remained uncertain, and previous attempts had demonstrated the difficulty of coordinating armor in the saturated fields. Throughout midday, sporadic fire continued from the pillbox. German defenders maintained discipline, conserving ammunition and firing in controlled bursts whenever movement was detected. Attempts by American riflemen to draw sustained fire met with limited response. The enemy appeared content to hold position and allow the attackers to expose themselves. By early afternoon, a decision was made at company level to conduct a limited probing action on the right flank. The objective was not to seize the farm outright, but to test the strength of the southern outbuilding and possibly identify a blind approach. Mercer's squad was assigned to support the movement with covering fire from the hedgerow. As the probing element advanced, mortar rounds landed behind them with increasing accuracy. It became evident that German observers had clear sight lines to the American line of departure. The patrol was forced to withdraw after encountering heavy fire from both the outbuilding and the pillbox. One man was wounded during the retreat and required assistance crossing the exposed field. The repetition of failed attempts began to influence discussion among junior leaders. In a brief exchange shielded from direct observation, Leland remarked to Lieutenant Whitaker that the pillbox's embrasure faced primarily west and northwest. The irrigation channel identified by the reconnaissance patrol ran closer to the north-northeast. If approached carefully, it might allow a small team to reach the rear slope without entering the primary field of fire. Whitaker acknowledged the observation, but noted the risks. The ground beyond the irrigation channel had not been fully cleared of mines, and artillery support for a small infiltration team would be minimal. Official doctrine emphasized coordinated assault rather than isolated action. Nevertheless, the current approach had yielded limited success. Mercer, positioned nearby while distributing ammunition, heard fragments of the discussion. He had spent part of the previous evening studying the terrain through intermittent flare light. From his foxhole, he had observed that German flares were frequently launched toward the central field, but less often toward the orchard behind the pillbox. The pattern suggested that the defenders prioritized observation of the main approach rather than the rear slope. In mid-afternoon, battalion headquarters transmitted orders to prepare for a renewed assault the following morning, pending artillery allocation. The intervening hours were to be used for reconnaissance and consolidation. Company B's men remained in their positions, alternating between watch and rest. The lull in major movement created space for reflection among the ranks. Mercer requested permission from Leland to accompany the next reconnaissance element along the irrigation channel. His request was framed as a practical matter. He had memorized certain landmarks along the northern hedgerow and believed he could assist in navigation under low visibility. Leland considered the request briefly before granting it, assigning Mercer as one of 3 riflemen to accompany a corporal and an engineer. Shortly before dusk, the small team began its crawl along the channel. The earth was saturated but firm enough to support slow movement. They advanced incrementally, pausing at irregular intervals to listen. German fire remained concentrated on the central field. The northern edge was comparatively quiet. At approximately 100 yards from the pillbox, the team halted. From their position, the rear slope became partially visible. The structure's back wall was embedded into a shallow rise with a narrow ventilation shaft protruding above ground level. No rear entrance was immediately visible from their vantage point. However, the orchard beyond offered intermittent cover from low stone walls and tree trunks. The engineer accompanying the patrol identified at least one disturbed patch of earth indicative of a buried mine. He marked it discreetly with a small cloth tied to a branch. Further movement would require careful probing. The team observed no direct enemy movement behind the pillbox, though distant voices carried faintly across the damp air. As light faded, the corporal signaled withdrawal. The information gathered was limited, but suggested that a small, carefully coordinated approach from the north-northeast might reach the rear slope without immediate exposure to the primary embrasure. Whether such an approach could be executed under combat conditions remained uncertain. Back at the hedgerow, Mercer reported observations to Leland and Lieutenant Whitaker. The lieutenant listened attentively, comparing the verbal description with the reconnaissance sketch. He made no immediate decision, but requested that the engineer provide a more detailed assessment of the mine placement the following morning. Night fell over the valley with reduced artillery activity. Company B maintained defensive posture while awaiting further orders. The fortified farm remained under German control, its pillbox intact despite repeated bombardment. Yet the reconnaissance had revealed a potential vulnerability not previously exploited. The question facing company leadership was whether deviation from established assault patterns could be justified within the broader operational framework. Mercer resumed his position in the foxhole, equipment cleaned and rifle within reach. The valley was quieter than on previous nights, broken only by occasional flare light and distant gunfire. Preparations continued for the next day's scheduled assault, even as alternative possibilities were weighed at the company level. On the morning of 17th October 1944, battalion headquarters confirmed that additional artillery support would not be available until late afternoon at the earliest. Ammunition stocks across the Corps sector had been redistributed to meet demands along a wider front. Company B was instructed to maintain pressure but avoid unnecessary exposure until coordinated fires could be arranged. Lieutenant Whitaker reviewed the reconnaissance notes gathered the previous evening. The irrigation channel north of the primary field remained the only identified approach not fully covered by the pillbox embrasure. By mid-morning, Whitaker requested a brief conference with Captain Ellis, Company B's commander. The discussion occurred in a shallow command post dug into the reverse slope behind the hedgerow. Present were Ellis, Whitaker, and the platoon sergeants, including Leland. Maps were unfolded on a wooden crate, weighted at the corners by spare ammunition magazines. Whitaker outlined the reconnaissance findings. He proposed dispatching a small infiltration team of 5 men along the irrigation channel during a period of suppressive fire directed toward the pillbox's front. The team would carry 2 satchel charges and approach the rear slope under engineer guidance. If the pillbox possessed a rear access point or ventilation aperture large enough to accept a charge, the team could attempt neutralization without requiring full-scale assault. Captain Ellis listened without interruption. He acknowledged the tactical logic but raised concerns regarding coordination. Battalion had scheduled a renewed combined arms attack for later that day, contingent on artillery timing. An independent infiltration attempt could interfere with those preparations or result in friendly fire if not precisely synchronized. After deliberation, Ellis authorized preliminary movement but stipulated strict conditions. The infiltration would occur during a controlled burst of company-level suppressive fire, not a full assault. No artillery would be requested during the attempt, and the team would withdraw immediately if detection occurred before reaching the rear slope. The action was to be reported to battalion as a reconnaissance in force rather than a deviation from plan. Leland assembled the infiltration team. He selected Mercer, the corporal who had led the previous reconnaissance, the accompanying engineer, and 1 additional rifleman. Each man carried standard equipment plus assigned demolition materials. The satchel charges were wrapped in oilcloth to protect fuses from dampness. Mercer checked the weight distribution in his pack, ensuring his rifle remained accessible. At approximately 1300 hours, Company B initiated suppressive fire toward the pillbox front and the southern outbuilding. The automatic rifle and several M1 rifles delivered controlled bursts at intervals, designed to maintain pressure without signaling a full advance. Smoke grenades were deployed selectively along the central field to reinforce the impression of continued frontal interest. Under this cover, the infiltration team entered the irrigation channel. Movement was slow and deliberate. The engineer advanced slightly ahead, probing the soil with a bayonet. When resistance indicated potential buried metal, he adjusted their path by small degrees. The damp earth absorbed sound, reducing the noise of their crawl. From the hedgerow, Leland observed through binoculars, tracking the team's progress as far as terrain allowed. German fire remained concentrated on the front arc, responding to suppressive bursts from Company B. No immediate reaction indicated awareness of the northern movement. After approximately 20 minutes, the team reached the orchard's edge. Low stone walls provided intermittent concealment. The rear slope of the pillbox was now within view at a distance of roughly 30 yards. The structure's concrete back appeared less reinforced than its frontal aspect, though still solid. A narrow steel door, partially recessed into the slope and shielded by earth, became visible from their angle. The presence of a rear entrance altered the tactical assessment. It had not been identified during earlier frontal observations. The door faced slightly northeast, positioned outside the direct line of sight from the main embrasure. No immediate guard was visible, though faint voices could be heard from within the structure. The engineer signaled caution. Mines could have been placed near the rear access. He probed carefully along the final stretch. One disturbed patch suggested recent soil movement, but no detonation occurred as they shifted course slightly westward. At this juncture, risk became immediate and personal. The suppressive fire from Company B could not continue indefinitely without revealing its limited scale. Any German soldier exiting the rear door or observing movement from a side aperture would compromise the attempt. Mercer positioned himself behind a low stone wall, covering the approach while the corporal and engineer prepared a satchel charge. The plan required placement of the charge against the steel door, followed by rapid withdrawal to the orchard wall. Fuse timing was calculated conservatively to allow sufficient distance. Mercer observed that the door's hinges were exposed externally, a detail not previously recorded in reconnaissance reports. As the corporal advanced the final yards toward the entrance, a brief burst of German fire erupted from the southern outbuilding, striking near the orchard's edge. It was unclear whether the shots were directed specifically at the infiltration team or at suppressive fire from the hedgerow. The team froze momentarily, pressed against ground and stone. From the front line, Leland intensified suppressive fire, directing the automatic rifle toward both the pillbox embrasure and the outbuilding windows. The volume increased sufficiently to suggest preparation for renewed assault, potentially distracting observers. The corporal reached the steel door and secured the satchel charge at its base, ensuring contact with the hinge area. The fuse was set. The team withdrew rapidly but in controlled movement back toward the orchard wall. Mercer maintained rear security, scanning for movement from the pillbox roof or adjacent structures. Within seconds of reaching partial cover, the charge detonated with a contained but forceful blast. Earth and debris were thrown outward from the rear slope. The steel door dislodged from its hinges, falling inward. Smoke and dust obscured the immediate view. German fire from the front embrasure ceased abruptly. Whether due to shock, internal casualties, or temporary disorientation was not immediately clear. The infiltration team remained in position, weapons trained on the damaged entrance, prepared for counterattack. From the hedgerow, Company B observed the plume of dust rising from behind the pillbox. Captain Ellis, recognizing the significance, ordered a limited advance to test the effect while maintaining readiness to withdraw if resistance resumed. Mercer and the infiltration team held their position at the orchard wall as the immediate aftermath of the explosion unfolded, aware that the next minutes would determine whether the structure had been neutralized or merely disturbed. The explosion at the rear of the pillbox produced a brief pause across the valley. For several seconds after the detonation, no fire emerged from the main embrasure. Dust drifted outward from the damaged rear entrance, settling slowly over the orchard slope. Lieutenant Whitaker reacted without raising his voice. He ordered 2nd Platoon to advance by bounds toward the irrigation channel, while 1st Platoon increased suppressive fire against the southern outbuilding. The shift was measured rather than impulsive. The objective was to determine whether the pillbox had been rendered inoperable before committing additional men. Mercer remained at the orchard wall with the infiltration team. Through the settling smoke, he could see that the steel door had been torn free and lay partially inside the structure. The blast had scarred the surrounding concrete but had not collapsed the roof. Faint movement was visible just within the doorway. The corporal signaled for a second charge. The original plan had accounted for the possibility that one detonation might not fully neutralize the position. The engineer prepared the remaining satchel while Mercer and the other riflemen provided cover. At that moment, a single German soldier stumbled from the doorway, disoriented and unarmed. He was quickly taken under guard by the advancing American infantry who had reached the outer edge of the orchard. No machine gun fire resumed from the embrasure. The absence was notable. Company B's suppressive fire shifted toward the southern outbuilding, where resistance remained active but less coordinated than before. Without the pillbox's interlocking support, the southern defenders appeared uncertain in their timing. Whitaker advanced to the forward edge of the irrigation channel, observing through field glasses. He signaled Mercer's team to proceed with the second charge to ensure the structure was fully disabled. The engineer placed the satchel just inside the doorway against the inner wall. The fuse was shortened to reduce delay. The team withdrew again, this time no more than 15 yards before the second explosion reverberated through the slope. The blast produced a deeper internal concussion. Smoke poured steadily from the entrance. When it cleared, no further movement was visible within the structure. By 1500 hours, Company B had secured the rear of the pillbox and confirmed that its primary weapon had been destroyed. Several German defenders inside had been killed by concussion and debris. Others were captured in shock. The embrasure at the front, once the focal point of repeated assaults, was silent. With the northern strongpoint neutralized, American infantry shifted focus toward the southern outbuilding. Deprived of interlocking fire and now vulnerable to envelopment, its defenders attempted brief resistance before withdrawing toward secondary positions east of the farm. By late afternoon, Company B had occupied the farm complex that had resisted 3 days of direct assault. Engineers conducted rapid clearance of the immediate area, identifying and marking remaining mines. Tanks were able to advance cautiously along the road by evening. The breach created by the destruction of the pillbox allowed 7 Corps to maintain pressure toward Aachen's outer defenses. In the days that followed, reports from battalion headquarters recorded the neutralization of the fortified position as the result of a small unit infiltration exploiting terrain on the northern flank. The official summary emphasized coordination and initiative at platoon level. Individual names were noted in after-action documentation but did not receive broader attention beyond regimental files. Mercer returned to routine duties within Company B. He assisted in consolidating new defensive positions beyond the captured farm and resumed carrying ammunition and maintaining watch rotations. Casualty replacements continued to arrive as fighting moved closer to Aachen's urban perimeter. Captain Ellis recommended Lieutenant Whitaker and Staff Sergeant Leland for commendations recognizing their leadership during the engagement. The infiltration team, including Mercer, received formal acknowledgement within company orders. The citation language remained restrained, reflecting the Army's preference for collective achievement over individual acclaim. The reduction of the pillbox did not conclude operations in the sector. Fighting within Aachen itself proved protracted and costly. Yet the opening created along that stretch of road permitted armored and supply elements to advance without the previous obstruction. The removal of a single fortified node altered the immediate tactical landscape sufficiently to allow coordinated movement forward. Post-war records indicate that the West Wall defenses in that area were constructed to delay rather than permanently halt advancing forces. Their effectiveness depended on disciplined occupation and overlapping fire. Once a single position was compromised from an unexpected direction, the integrity of the defensive pattern weakened. Mercer completed his service in Europe in 1945 and returned to civilian life without public recognition beyond his unit's documentation. In later years, regimental historians reviewing archived reports identified the infiltration at the farm as an example of adaptive small unit action under constrained resources. The event did not feature prominently in larger operational histories, which focused instead on divisional maneuvers and strategic objectives. The capture of the farm complex east of the Wurm River on 17 October 1944 remains a modest entry in official records. Yet within Company B, it marked the moment when repeated frontal losses gave way to a solution shaped by observation and measured risk. One soldier's careful attention to terrain and pattern, combined with the judgment of immediate superiors willing to depart slightly from routine assault methods, produced a localized breakthrough. Military archives preserve the after-action report in plain language. It records time, coordinates, casualties, and ammunition expenditure. Between those lines rests the quiet fact that a single initiative at squad level shifted the balance of that engagement sufficiently to open the road ahead.